The castle stood like a stone monument against the gray sky of the Northern Territories, its towers piercing the heavy clouds that rolled endlessly across the American wilderness. This was not the America of cities and highways, but the America of old forests and hidden valleys, where ancient bloodlines still ruled over territories marked by treaties older than memory. Here, in the shadow of the mountain range that separated the kingdom from the rest of civilization, power was not elected but inherited, passed down through generations of alphas whose voices could command obedience with a single word. The night Prince Adrian was born, the castle trembled with anticipation. King Marcus, the most powerful alpha in 3 generations, paced the corridor outside the birthing chamber, while his advisors stood in rigid silence. The queen's labor had been long and difficult, but when the midwife finally emerged with the infant wrapped in crimson silk, every face turned toward the child with reverent expectation. This was the heir, the next Alpha King, the one who would carry the bloodline forward into another century of dominance. But something was wrong. The baby did not cry. His eyes opened, dark and aware, but no sound escaped his lips. The midwife, an elderly woman who had delivered 3 generations of royal children, felt the first cold touch of fear as she held the silent infant. She called his name softly, then louder, clapping her hands near his tiny ears. Nothing. No flinch. No reaction. No acknowledgement of the sounds that filled the room. King Marcus took his son with hands that could crush stone, holding the child up to the candlelight as if inspecting a flawed jewel. He spoke the ancient words of claiming, the phrases that bound an heir to his bloodline. But the infant's gaze remained distant, unfocused on his father's moving lips. The king's voice rose, frustration bleeding into command, but still the child showed no recognition. When he finally handed Adrian back to the midwife, his expression had already begun to harden into the mask he would wear for years to come. The whispers started that very night. Servants spoke in hushed tones about the silent prince, about what it meant for an alpha heir to be born without hearing. The kingdom's laws were clear and cruel. An alpha must be able to hear commands, to recognize challenges, to understand the subtle vocal cues that maintained the hierarchy. A deaf alpha was not just unusual, it was dangerous. How could he lead warriors if he could not hear their oaths? How could he maintain order if he could not detect the tremor of defiance in a subject's voice? How could he rule if he existed outside the very system that defined rulership? As Adrian grew from infant to child, the castle became his prison and his school. While other children of noble blood trained in the courtyard, learning to project their voices with alpha authority, Adrian watched from high windows, his small hands pressed against cold glass. His mother, Queen Helena, tried desperately to reach him, speaking slowly and clearly, hoping he might learn to read her lips. But the king forbade it. Marcus believed that coddling the boy would only make him weaker, and weakness was not tolerated in the royal bloodline. So Adrian learned alone. He taught himself to read the shapes words made on people's mouths, to interpret the tension in shoulders and the flicker of eyes that betrayed true intentions. He felt vibrations that others ignored, the rumble of footsteps on stone floors, the subtle shift in air pressure when doors opened, the tremor of angry voices even when he could not hear their words. The world presented itself to him differently than it did to others, and he adapted with an intelligence that surprised even those who pitied him. By his 10th year, Adrian had stopped trying to speak. His voice, when he did use it, sounded strange even to his own limited perception, too loud or too soft, never quite calibrated to match the situation. He communicated through writing and gesture, developing a precise sign language that his personal attendant, an older beta named Thomas, learned to interpret. Thomas became his voice to the world, translating Adrian's thoughts into spoken words, though the prince suspected his messages were often softened or altered before reaching other ears. The king's attitude toward his son existed somewhere between disappointment and cold determination. Marcus did not abandon Adrian, but neither did he show him affection. Instead, He pushed the boy through rigorous physical training, ensuring that if Adrian could not command with voice, he would at least dominate through strength. The prince learned to fight with brutal efficiency, his other senses compensating for his lack of hearing. He could sense an opponent's movement through the vibration of floorboards, predict attacks by reading micro-expressions, and strike with precision that unnerved even seasoned warriors. But physical prowess was not enough to quiet the whispers. The noble families who served the crown began to question whether Adrian should inherit at all. Some suggested that Marcus take another wife, father another heir, one who could hear the world properly. Others proposed that a distant cousin, a minor alpha with untainted senses, might be more suitable to continue the bloodline. These conversations happened in rooms Adrian was not invited to, but he felt their impact nonetheless, in the way servants looked at him with pity, in the way guards hesitated to bow, in the way his own father seemed to see through him rather than at him. Queen Helena fought these whispers with maternal ferocity, but even she could not deny the practical concerns. One evening, when Adrian was 12, he found her weeping in the garden, her hands clutched around a silver locket containing his baby portrait. She did not know he was there, could not hear his soft approach, and when she finally noticed him standing in the shadows, she tried to compose herself. But Adrian had already seen what he needed to see. Even his mother, who loved him, harbored doubts about his future. That night, alone in his chambers, Adrian made a decision. If he could not rule through traditional alpha dominance, he would forge a different kind of power. He would become indispensable through strategy, through understanding politics and economics and warfare in ways that transcended vocal commands. He would prove that leadership required more than a loud voice and a commanding presence. He would show them all that silence could be its own form of strength. For the next 6 years, Adrian transformed himself into something the kingdom had never seen before. He studied ancient texts on governance and military tactics, learning from historical leaders who had overcome their own limitations. He trained his body until it became a weapon precise enough to protect himself without guard assistance. He developed networks of information, learning to read the castle's pulse through observation alone. People underestimated him, assumed his silence meant ignorance, and in their carelessness, they revealed more than they ever would have to a traditional heir. But despite all his adaptations, all his carefully constructed defenses, Adrian could not escape the fundamental loneliness of his existence. He watched couples walk together through the gardens, their conversations flowing easily in ways he would never experience. He observed the natural hierarchy of the kingdom, where every interaction was mediated through complex vocal cues he could only guess at. He felt the weight of expectation pressing down on him, the knowledge that unless something changed dramatically, his 18th birthday would not mark his coronation but rather his displacement. The throne room had become a place of particular pain. Once a month, King Marcus held court, and Adrian was required to sit beside him on a smaller throne, watching justice dispensed and oaths taken, all through a filter of silence. He could see when people lied, could read their fear and resentment and desperation, but he could not hear the words that sealed their fates. Thomas would lean close afterward, explaining what had been decided, but second-hand knowledge was not the same as true participation. Adrian was present but fundamentally absent, a ghost haunting his own future. On the evening of his 17th birthday, as autumn rain battered the castle walls and the first frost touched the mountain peaks, Adrian stood at his window and watched the kingdom spread out below. Lights flickered in distant villages where common people lived simpler lives, unbound by the complex hierarchies of Alpha, Beta, and Omega. He wondered what it would be like to exist outside these rigid structures, to be judged by actions rather than bloodline, to live without the constant scrutiny of those waiting for him to fail. He did not know that far beyond his sight, on a road that wound through the forgotten edges of his father's territory, someone was walking toward a destiny that would intersect with his own. Someone whose very existence would challenge everything the kingdom believed about power and voice and the nature of true strength. Someone whose song, when it finally reached him, would crack open the walls he had built around his silent world and let something unexpected flood in. The rain continued to fall, washing over stone and forest alike. And in the distance, carried on wind he could not hear, came the first notes of a melody that would change everything. The road that wound through the western territories of the Alpha King's domain was rarely traveled. It cut through dense forest, where morning mist clung to ancient trees, past abandoned settlements where nature had reclaimed what civilization once held, and alongside streams that ran cold and clear from mountain sources. This was where Lyra walked, her worn leather boots moving steadily over uneven ground, her faded cloak pulled tight against the chill that preceded winter's arrival. She had been traveling for so long that she sometimes forgot what it meant to stay in one place. 6 years on the road, maybe 7. Time blurred when you carried no calendar and measured days only by the distance covered. Lyra had no permanent home, no fixed name in most places, and no allegiance to any of the territorial pacts that divided this part of America into invisible kingdoms. She was Omega by nature, which meant she existed outside the traditional power structures. But she was also something rarer and more troubling to those who tried to categorize her. She was completely unbound. Most Omegas eventually affiliated with a pack, finding protection and purpose within established hierarchies. The alternative was dangerous. Lone Omegas were vulnerable to exploitation, to forced bonding, to the kind of violence that authorities conveniently overlooked. But Lyra had discovered early in her travels that she possessed something that functioned as its own protection, something that both fascinated and frightened those who encountered it. She could sing in ways that defied normal understanding, her voice carrying qualities that seemed to bypass conscious thought and speak directly to something deeper. It was not the commanding alpha voice that could enforce obedience, nor was it the soothing beta tone that could calm tensions. Lyra's singing was something altogether different, something ancient and strange. When she sang, people reported feeling as though memories long buried rose to the surface, as though emotions they had suppressed demanded acknowledgement, as though truths they had hidden from themselves became suddenly unavoidable. It was not comfortable. It was not always welcome. But it was undeniably powerful. She had first discovered this ability at 14, in the small mountain community where she had been raised. Her mother, an unaffiliated Omega who had died when Lyra was young, had occasionally hummed melodies that seemed to ease the sick and comfort the grieving. Lyra had assumed it was simply kindness, the effect of a caring presence. But when she began singing those same melodies after her mother's death, something different happened. A man recovering from injury suddenly remembered how he had been hurt, breaking through the defensive amnesia that had protected him from trauma. A woman grieving her lost child finally wept, years of suppressed sorrow pouring out in racking sobs that, strangely, left her more at peace. The community's alpha had been disturbed by these incidents. Unpredictable emotional responses disrupted the careful balance of pack dynamics. After several unsettling episodes where Lyra's singing seemed to trigger confessions and confrontations, the alpha had given her a choice. Stop singing entirely, or leave. Lyra had chosen the road, understanding even then that her gift, if it could be called that, was not meant for enclosed spaces and rigid hierarchies. In the years since, she had survived by moving constantly, never staying long enough for her presence to become threatening. She sang for her supper in taverns where travelers gathered, telling stories through melodies that made listeners remember their own forgotten tales. She offered her voice to those struggling with grief or guilt, sitting with them as her songs pulled buried feelings into the light where they could be examined and sometimes released. She asked for little in return, accepting food, shelter, or simple courtesy as payment enough. But she was not naive about the dangers. There had been close calls, times when powerful alphas had tried to claim her, believing that controlling her voice would give them leverage over others. There had been nights spent hiding in cold forests, days walking without food to avoid settlements that felt hostile. There had been moments when she questioned whether freedom was worth the constant uncertainty, whether she should simply submit to someone's protection and accept the limitations that came with it. Yet whenever that temptation arose, Lyra would find herself singing one of her mother's old melodies, and the answer would become clear again. Her voice belonged to no one but herself. Her songs could not be owned or directed by another's will. The moment she submitted to a traditional bond, something essential would die inside her, and the music that was as natural as breathing would become forced and false. As she walked the lonely road toward the heart of the Alpha King's territory, Lyra felt an unusual pull, something she could not quite name. It was not physical danger. Her instincts had become finely tuned to that particular sensation. This was different, more like curiosity mixed with inevitability, as though something ahead required her presence in ways she did not yet understand. She had learned to trust these inexplicable feelings. They had guided her away from danger more than once, and toward people who needed what only her voice could provide. The forest thinned as she climbed higher into the foothills, and through breaks in the trees, she caught glimpses of the castle that dominated this region. It was massive and imposing, built from gray stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Watchtowers rose at each corner, and even from a distance Lyra could see guards patrolling the walls with military precision. This was the seat of King Marcus's power, the heart of the strongest Alpha domain in this part of the continent. Common sense suggested she should avoid such places. Royal courts were the most rigid in their hierarchies, the most intolerant of anything that disrupted established order. An unaffiliated Omega wandering too close to a king's castle was asking for trouble. At minimum, she would be questioned about her purpose and possibly detained for her own protection, which was simply another form of captivity. Yet the pull she felt only grew stronger as the castle came into clearer view, and Lyra had long ago learned that fighting such intuitions only delayed the inevitable. She made camp that evening in a small clearing, within sight of the castle's outer walls, building a modest fire and preparing a simple meal from the supplies in her pack. As darkness fell and stars emerged in the clear autumn sky, she found herself humming without conscious decision, letting a melody rise naturally from the quietness around her. It was one of her mother's oldest songs, wordless and haunting, the kind that seemed to slip between worlds. What Lyra did not know, could not have known, was that her voice carried farther than she imagined on the still night air. The castle, built to amplify and project the Alpha King's commands across great distances, had acoustics designed by architects who understood how sound traveled through stone. In creating a structure that magnified power, they had also created one that could channel unexpected sounds into places they were never meant to reach. High in the eastern tower, in chambers that faced the forest where Lyra camped, Prince Adrian stood at his window as he did most evenings. He could see the distant fire, small and isolated, and wondered idly about the traveler who would camp so close to the castle, rather than seeking hospitality within. His hand rested against the stone wall, feeling the castle's vibrations as he had learned to do, reading the information that came through touch rather than sound. And then something impossible happened. Adrian felt a new vibration, different from anything he had experienced before. It was not the heavy rumble of footsteps or the sharp percussion of doors closing. It was something far more subtle, almost liquid in quality. A pattern that seemed to resonate not just through the stone but through his chest, his throat, the very bones of his skull. For several seconds he could not identify what he was experiencing, his mind scrambling to categorize this unprecedented sensation. Then understanding struck with shocking force. He was feeling music. Not hearing it in the traditional sense, but perceiving it through every other avenue his body provided. The vibrations carried rhythm and variation, pattern and intention. They held emotion in their fluctuations, sadness and hope woven together in ways that made his breath catch. And beneath it all, beneath the technical perception of frequency and resonance, something deeper stirred, something that recognized this not as mere sound, but as communication, as meaning, as truth expressed in a language that bypassed his damaged ears entirely. Adrian pressed both palms flat against the wall, his whole body suddenly alert. the sensation grew stronger, as though by opening himself to it, he had increased his capacity to receive. He could sense the melodies rise and fall, could feel how certain phrases repeated with slight variations, could detect the underlying structure that made this more than random noise. It was complex and beautiful, and utterly overwhelming to someone who had lived his entire life in silence. But more than the technical marvel of perceiving music through alternate senses, what truly shook Adrian was what the music seemed to carry within it. As he stood there, hands pressed to stone and body thrumming with unfamiliar resonance, he felt something inside himself respond. It was as though a door he had not known existed had suddenly opened, revealing a room full of things he had locked away without realizing. Grief for the childhood he had never had. Longing for connection he had convinced himself he did not need. Fear about a future that seemed predetermined toward failure. And beneath it all, a desperate hope that somehow, impossibly, things could be different. The music continued for perhaps 10 minutes, though Adrian lost all sense of time as he stood transfixed. When it finally faded, the silence that returned felt different than before, heavier and more absolute, as though the brief intrusion of melody had somehow made the lack of it more profound. He remained at the window long after the last vibrations dissipated, his mind racing through implications he could barely begin to process. Someone out there had a voice that could reach him, not through the traditional pathway of sound hitting eardrums and translating to neural signals, but through some other channel he did not understand. It should not be possible. Every healer and scholar his father had consulted had confirmed that his deafness was absolute, that no amount of volume or special technique could overcome the fundamental physical damage. Yet what he had just experienced was undeniable. He had perceived music in ways that transcended his body's limitations. Adrian called for Thomas, signing urgently when his attendant arrived. "What is that?" He gestured toward the distant fire, his movements sharp with intensity he rarely showed. "Who camps there?" Thomas looked confused, squinting into the darkness where the small fire flickered. "Just a traveler, my prince. A woman traveling alone, it seems. The guards reported her presence but saw no threat. Likely just passing through the territory." "Find out who she is," Adrian signed. His hands trembled slightly, adrenaline still coursing through his system. "I need to know everything about her." Thomas nodded. Though his expression carried questions he was wise enough not to voice. As he left to make inquiries, Adrian returned to the window, searching the darkness for any sign of movement near that distant fire. For the first time in his 17 years, something had broken through the absolute barrier of his silence. And though he could not have explained why, he knew with bone-deep certainty that his life had just fundamentally changed direction. In her camp, unaware of the profound impact her evening song had created, Lyra settled into her bedroll and watched the stars wheel slowly overhead. Tomorrow she would continue her journey, perhaps toward the castle itself, if the strange pull she felt persisted. Perhaps in some other direction, if circumstances suggested caution. She had no plans, no expectations, no awareness that she had just announced her presence to the one person in the kingdom who could perceive her voice in ways no one else could. The fire burned low, and Lyra drifted toward sleep, while in the castle high above, a prince who had never heard music sat awake through the entire night, his world irrevocably transformed by a song he had felt rather than heard. The reports Thomas brought back were frustratingly sparse. The woman camped in the forest was an unaffiliated Omega, traveling alone with minimal supplies and no apparent destination. She had committed no crimes, posed no obvious threat, and seemed content to keep to herself. The border guards had noted her presence as required by protocol, but saw no reason for concern. She was simply another wanderer passing through the territory, unremarkable except for her solitary status, and the fact that she had chosen to camp within sight of the castle rather than seeking shelter in one of the nearby villages. Adrian read the brief written report 3 times, searching for details that were not there. No name, or rather, she had given different names to different people, which suggested either deception or someone who had moved so often that fixed identity had become fluid. No home settlement, no family connections that could be traced, no allegiance to any pack or territorial alpha. She had been seen in various regions over the past several years, always traveling, always alone, occasionally singing in taverns or at gatherings, but never staying long enough to establish roots. What the report did not include, because no one thought to mention it, was how people responded to her singing. That information existed in scattered anecdotes and unconnected stories across multiple territories. But King Marcus's intelligence network was designed to track potential threats and political movements, not the subtle emotional impact of an itinerant Omega's voice. So Adrian had only the official assessment: unremarkable, unthreatening, unlikely to remain in the area beyond a few days. He disagreed entirely with that assessment. Nothing about last night had been unremarkable. The vibrations he had felt through the castle walls had been unlike anything in his 17 years of developing alternative ways to perceive the world. More importantly, the response those vibrations had triggered inside him, the sudden upwelling of suppressed emotions and uncomfortable truths, suggested that this woman's voice carried power that his father's advisors had completely failed to recognize. Adrian made a decision that surprised even himself. He would go to her, not with guards and formal introduction, but quietly and alone. This broke multiple protocols. As the heir apparent, he was not supposed to leave the castle grounds without escort. As the king's son, he was not supposed to interact with unaffiliated Omegas, who could potentially try to form bonds that would complicate succession politics. And as someone whose safety was constantly questioned due to his inability to hear threats, he was certainly not supposed to venture into forests alone where danger could approach without his knowledge. But Adrian had spent his entire life working within systems designed for people unlike himself, following rules that assumed capabilities he did not possess. For once, he wanted to act on his own judgment, following the pull of something that felt more right than all the careful protocols that had shaped his constrained existence. Besides, he rationalized, what real danger could an unescorted Omega traveling alone possibly pose? If she had wanted to approach the castle with malicious intent, she would have done so already. That afternoon, while the castle staff was occupied with preparations for the evening meal and his father was meeting with territorial representatives, Adrian slipped out through a servant's passage he had discovered years earlier. He dressed in plain clothes that would not immediately identify him as royalty, though his bearing and the way he moved with warrior's precision would mark him as someone of significance to any trained observer. Thomas, the only person who knew where Adrian had gone, looked deeply uncomfortable, but did not try to stop him. The prince's attendant had learned long ago that Adrian's silence hid a will as strong as his father's, perhaps stronger for being less obviously expressed. The path down from the castle took Adrian through terraced gardens and into the forest that surrounded the royal grounds. He moved carefully, feeling vibrations through the earth that told him when others were nearby, reading the environment through senses most people ignored. The autumn afternoon was cold and clear, frost crunching under his boots, and his breath visible in small clouds he could see but not hear. Everything was rendered in the peculiar stillness that had been his constant companion since birth, beautiful and lonely in equal measure. He found Lyra's camp easily. The location was not hidden, and the remains of last night's fire still smoldered faintly. She sat on a fallen log near the cold fire pit, working on something he could not immediately identify, her dark hair falling forward to obscure her face. She wore practical traveling clothes in shades of gray and brown, and her cloak, though patched and faded, was well maintained. There was something about her posture, relaxed but alert, that suggested she was aware of his approach long before he entered the clearing. When she looked up, Adrian felt an unexpected jolt of recognition. Not that he had seen her before, but as though something in him knew something in her and vice versa. Her eyes were unusual, more gray than blue or green, and they held an expression of calm assessment rather than the fear or deference he typically encountered. She did not immediately speak, which Adrian appreciated. And when she finally did address him, She spoke slowly and clearly, positioning herself so he could see her lips. "You're from the castle," she said. It was not a question. "The prince, unless I miss my guess, though you're dressed like you're trying not to be recognized." Adrian felt surprise ripple through him. Most people did not immediately deduce his identity when he was dressed plainly and unaccompanied. He nodded, watching her carefully for signs of alarm or calculation, but found neither. Instead, she simply gestured to a spot near the fire. "You're welcome to sit if you'd like. The fire's mostly dead, but I can rebuild it if you're staying." He sat, aware that this entire interaction was highly unusual. She had not bowed, had not addressed him with any title, had not even seemed particularly impressed by royal presence. It was oddly refreshing. When he gestured to indicate his inability to hear, then pointed to his eyes to show he needed to see her lips, she nodded with immediate understanding. "You can't hear," she said, speaking carefully. "That must be challenging in a place where so much depends on voice and command." There was no pity in her tone, only matter-of-fact acknowledgement, which Adrian found even more refreshing. He pulled out the small journal he always carried, writing quickly before showing her the page. "Last night, I felt your singing. Not heard, felt, through the castle walls. It was unlike anything I've ever experienced." Lyra's eyes widened slightly as she read, the first real surprise he had seen her show. She looked from the page to his face, studying him with new intensity. "You felt it, but you can't hear?" He nodded, then wrote again. "I don't understand how it's possible. But when you sang, I could perceive it through vibration, through sensation. And it carried emotion, meaning, things I can't explain." She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant as though considering something complex. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. "I've never met anyone who experienced my singing the way you're describing. Most people hear it normally, though they say it affects them differently than ordinary music. But you're perceiving something else entirely." "What is it?" he wrote. "Your voice. What makes it different?" "I don't know exactly," she admitted. "My mother could do something similar, though not as strongly. When I sing certain melodies, people seem to remember things, feel things they've been avoiding. It's like the music bypasses their conscious defenses and speaks to something deeper. It makes people uncomfortable sometimes, which is why I keep moving rather than staying anywhere long." Adrian absorbed this, his mind working through implications. If her voice could bypass conscious defenses and speak to deeper levels of awareness, perhaps it could also bypass damaged physical pathways and communicate through the resonance of bone and tissue rather than through air and eardrums. It was impossible according to everything he had been taught about how sound and hearing worked, yet it had undeniably happened. "Sing something now," he wrote. "I want to understand." Lyra hesitated, clearly uncertain. "Are you sure?" "I don't always control what emotions surface when I sing. And for you, if you're perceiving it through your whole body rather than just ears, it might be intense." He nodded firmly, meeting her eyes with an expression that communicated his determination. She studied him for another moment, then nodded and stood, moving to face him directly. She took a breath, and Adrian saw her entire body settle into readiness, like a warrior preparing for combat, though what she prepared for was something entirely different. When she began to sing, Adrian felt it immediately. The vibrations moved through the air between them, but more than that, they seemed to resonate directly with his chest, his throat, the bones of his face and skull. It was the same sensation he had felt last night, but far more powerful at close range, and Lyra had been right to warn him. It was intensely overwhelming, not painful, but so present and so demanding of attention that it felt almost like being physically touched. But beyond the pure sensory experience, the emotions came flooding back even stronger than before. All the grief he had carefully buried, All the loneliness he had learned to ignore, all the fear about his uncertain future, all the anger at circumstances he could not control. All of it rose to the surface with unavoidable force. His eyes stung with tears he had not allowed himself to cry in years, and his hands clenched into fists as he fought to maintain composure against the tide of feeling. Lyra's song was not long, perhaps 2 minutes of wordless melody that seemed to wind through his entire being. When she stopped, the silence that followed felt vast and echoing. Adrian sat motionless, breathing hard, struggling to repack all the emotions that had been pulled into the light. He felt raw and exposed in ways that were deeply uncomfortable. Yet beneath the discomfort was something else, a strange sense of relief, as though by finally acknowledging what he felt instead of suppressing it, some hidden tension had finally been released. "Are you all right?" Lyra asked, her expression concerned. She had not moved closer, respecting his space while his composure returned. Adrian nodded slowly, then reached for his journal with hands that still trembled slightly. "I understand now," he wrote. "Why people fear your voice. Not because it's harmful, but because it's honest. It doesn't let you hide from yourself." "That's exactly it," she said quietly. "Most people spend so much energy maintaining walls between who they are and who they show the world. My singing dissolves those walls, at least temporarily. It's why I could never stay in a traditional pack. Too many secrets, too many carefully maintained illusions. My presence disrupts everything." "The same is true for me," Adrian wrote. "I disrupt the natural hierarchy just by existing, an alpha who cannot hear the very commands and cues that define alpha power. My father sees me as a problem to be managed, not a son to be loved. The nobles see me as a threat to stability. Even those who are kind to me pity me more than they respect me." Lyra read his words carefully, and when she looked up, her expression held understanding rather than pity. "So we're both outside the system in our own ways. You because you can't participate in it as expected, me because I won't. That must be incredibly lonely for you, being surrounded by people yet fundamentally separate from them." The simple recognition of his loneliness, spoken without drama or excessive sympathy, affected Adrian more deeply than he would have expected. He nodded, not trusting himself to write a response that would not reveal too much vulnerability. They sat in companionable silence for several minutes, two people who understood what it meant to exist on the margins of a world that had no proper place for them. Finally, Lyra spoke again. "Why did you come down here? You must have known it was risky, leaving the castle alone." Adrian wrote, "Because last night, for the first time in my life, I felt less alone. When your song reached me, it was like discovering that communication is possible in ways I never imagined. I had to know more. I had to meet the person whose voice could reach me when nothing else ever has. And now that you have..." He paused, considering the question carefully before writing his response. "Now I want to understand how. I want to know if this is something that can be repeated, controlled, used. Not used in a manipulative sense, but used to bridge the gap between my world and the normal one. If your voice can reach me this way, perhaps there are other possibilities I never considered." Lyra looked troubled. "I don't know if what I do can be taught or controlled. It's intuitive for me, something I learned to work with but never fully understood, and I'm not sure I want to experiment with it, especially not for something as political as helping a prince overcome his disability to claim a throne. That feels like turning my voice into a tool for power, which is exactly what I've been avoiding." Adrian felt a flash of frustration, followed immediately by shame. She was right. His first instinct had been to think about practical applications, rather than respecting the autonomy of her gift. He wrote, "You're right. I'm sorry. I've spent so long thinking about how to compensate for what I lack that I immediately jumped to using your voice instrumentally. That was wrong." The apology seemed to surprise her. "Most people don't apologize when I refuse them, especially not royalty. They usually try to convince me, or offer payment, or imply that refusing them is some kind of offense. Your voice is yours, he wrote firmly. No one has the right to demand you use it in ways you're uncomfortable with. I should have simply thanked you for helping me understand what I experienced, not immediately tried to turn it into something useful for my situation. Lyra studied him for a long moment, her gray eyes searching his face for something she apparently found, because her expression softened. You're different than I expected a king's son to be. Less entitled, more thoughtful. Tell me, do you actually want the throne you're supposed to inherit? Or do you feel trapped by expectations you never chose? The question struck deep, touching something Adrian had never fully admitted even to himself. He sat with it for several seconds before beginning to write, and what emerged was more honest than he had intended. I don't know if I want it. Sometimes I think I would be relieved if they chose someone else, found a way to pass over me for a more suitable heir. But other times I think about everything I've learned, all the ways I've adapted, and I believe I could rule differently than my father. Not through dominance and command, but through understanding and observation. I see things others miss because I experience the world differently. Maybe that perspective has value, or maybe that's just pride speaking, trying to convince myself my suffering has meaning. When she finished reading, Lyra looked at him with something that might have been respect. That's a more honest answer than most powerful people would give. The fact that you question your own motives, that you consider the possibility that you might be wrong, that's actually a sign of wisdom rather than weakness. Easy to be wise when you have no real power, Adrian wrote, a touch of bitterness coloring his thoughts. Wisdom without the ability to act on it is just frustrated observation. Maybe, Lyra conceded. Or maybe wisdom is exactly what's needed before power is granted. Too many leaders have power without wisdom, and look at the damage they cause. Their conversation continued as afternoon light slanted lower through the trees, and the temperature dropped further. They talked about loneliness and belonging, about the costs of existing outside established structures, about what it meant to be born into roles that did not quite fit. Adrian found himself writing things he had never articulated before. Thoughts and feelings that Thomas would have been uncomfortable hearing, that his mother would have worried over, that his father would have dismissed as weakness. Lyra, in turn, spoke about her years of traveling, about the people she had met, and the ways her voice had affected them. She described a woman who had finally confronted her abusive partner after years of denial, prompted by a song that made the truth undeniable. She told of a man who reconciled with his estranged son when melody dissolved the pride that had kept them apart. She spoke of grief acknowledged, trauma processed, and joy rediscovered by people who had numbed themselves to feeling anything at all. But it's not all positive, she admitted. Sometimes the truth hurts too much. Sometimes people aren't ready for what surfaces. I once sang for a gathering, and a man became so overwhelmed by suppressed guilt that he harmed himself after I left. I didn't know until months later, when I passed through the area again and heard the story. That's when I understood how dangerous my voice could be, how much responsibility comes with affecting people at such deep levels. Adrian wrote, "Yet you continue. You could stop singing those kinds of songs, stick to simple melodies that don't carry that power." I could, she agreed, but then I'd be suppressing something essential to who I am. I'd be choosing safety and comfort over authenticity, and I'd be abandoning the few people who truly need what my voice can provide, the ones who are drowning in unacknowledged pain and have no other way to reach it. So I keep moving, keep singing, and try to be careful about when and where and for whom. That's a kind of courage, Adrian wrote. Choosing the harder path because it's honest rather than the easier path that would require you to diminish yourself. Maybe, Lyra said softly, or maybe it's just stubbornness. Sometimes I wonder if I'm really helping people, or just satisfying my own need to believe my strange gift has purpose. Both can be true, Adrian wrote. Motivation is rarely pure, But the outcome matters more than the motivation. If you help people find truth they need, does it matter if you also need to feel your gift has value? She smiled at that, the first real smile he had seen from her. You really do think differently, don't you? Not just because you're deaf, but because you've developed a whole philosophy around observation and interpretation. Adrian felt warmth at the observation, the recognition of his intellectual development as something valuable rather than merely compensatory. But before he could write a response, he felt something change in the vibrations around them. Someone was approaching through the forest, moving with purpose, and given the weight and rhythm of the footfalls, multiple someones. He stood quickly, his body tensing in response to potential threat. Lyra noticed his reaction and rose as well, turning to look in the direction he was facing. Within seconds, 6 castle guards emerged from the trees, led by Captain Reeves, his father's head of security. They were not running, but their approach was unmistakably aggressive, hands on weapons even if those weapons remained sheathed. Thomas followed behind the guards, looking apologetic and worried. When the group reached the clearing, Captain Reeves spoke directly to Adrian, though Thomas translated into sign even as the captain's lips formed words. "My prince, you were reported missing hours ago. The king has the entire guard searching for you. You must return to the castle immediately." Adrian signed a response that Thomas translated. "I came here of my own accord. I am in no danger." "Nevertheless," Reeves continued, his expression stern, "your safety is our responsibility, and you are not to leave the castle grounds without proper escort. This is not negotiable." Adrian felt anger rise, familiar and bitter. Even here, even in this moment of genuine connection with someone who understood aspects of his experience no one else could, the restrictions closed in. He was not permitted autonomy, not allowed to make decisions about his own movements, not trusted to assess and manage his own risks. But before he could formulate another argument, Captain Reeves turned his attention to Lyra. "And you, Omega, explain your purpose for camping so close to the royal residence and for engaging in unauthorized contact with the crown prince." Lyra met the captain's gaze without flinching. "I'm traveling through the territory, as is my right. I camped here because it's public forest. And the prince approached me, not the other way around. I've committed no crime and violated no law. An unaffiliated Omega has no rights in this territory," Reeves said coldly. "You exist here by the king's tolerance, nothing more. And when that tolerance is tested by suspicious behavior near the castle, it can be withdrawn very quickly." Adrian felt protective anger flare, stronger than his personal frustration. He signed rapidly, and Thomas translated with obvious discomfort. "This woman has done nothing wrong. I sought her out because I had questions about music that she might answer. Your treatment of her is inappropriate and reflects poorly on the king's justice." Reeves looked unmoved. "My prince, you are not yet in a position to determine what reflects well or poorly on the king's justice. Your safety has been compromised, and this woman's presence is suspicious regardless of her stated intentions. She will be escorted to the castle for questioning, and you will return immediately." The message was clear. This was not a discussion, but an order, and while they would phrase it respectfully given Adrian's rank, they were prepared to enforce it if he resisted. He looked at Lyra, seeing resignation in her expression rather than fear. She had clearly experienced this kind of treatment before, the way authorities viewed unaffiliated Omegas as inherently suspicious, their autonomy subject to revocation at any moment. "If you must take me back, you will allow her to gather her belongings and walk freely." Adrian signed with sharp, angry movements. "She will not be dragged or restrained like a criminal, and I will personally ensure my father understands that any mistreatment of her will have consequences." Thomas translated with slightly softened phrasing, but the intent came through. Reeves clearly wanted to argue, but recognized that pushing the prince too hard in this moment would cause problems he did not want to deal with. He nodded curtly. "Very well. The Omega may accompany us unrestrained, but she remains under watch until the king determines her status. As Lyra gathered her minimal belongings, Adrian caught her eye. He made a gesture he hoped she would understand, a promise that this was not over, that he would not allow her to be mistreated simply because their encounter had revealed his unauthorized departure from the castle. She nodded slightly, acknowledging the gesture without false optimism about what it might mean. The walk back to the castle was tense and silent. Guards surrounded them in a configuration that was nominally protective, but felt like imprisonment. Adrian's mind raced through possible outcomes and strategies, knowing that once his father learned what had happened, the situation would become exponentially more complex. What he did not yet know was that King Marcus had already been informed not just of Adrian's disappearance, but of the mysterious Omega, whose singing had been reported by multiple guards over the past day, and the king, whose entire reign had been built on controlling hierarchy and maintaining order through careful management of alpha, beta, and omega dynamics, had already begun forming conclusions about what this woman's presence near his castle meant, and what measures would be necessary to neutralize the disruption she represented. By the time they reached the castle gates, the sun had set, and torches blazed along the walls, casting everything in sharp contrast of light and shadow. Adrian looked back once at Lyra walking behind him, her expression unreadable, her shoulders straight despite the circumstances. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, he made a silent vow. Whatever his father decided, whatever restrictions were imposed, he would find a way to ensure that the first person whose voice had ever truly reached him would not become just another casualty of the kingdom's rigid order. But making such promises and keeping them were very different things, as Adrian was about to discover. The real challenge was just beginning, and the forces arrayed against any disruption to established power were far stronger than one isolated prince and one traveling Omega, no matter how unique their connection might be. If you're enjoying this story so far, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next chapters. The journey of Adrian and Lyra is only beginning, and things are about to become much more complicated. The throne room of King Marcus was designed to intimidate. Massive stone columns rose 30 feet to a vaulted ceiling painted with scenes of alpha victories from centuries past. The throne itself sat on a raised dais, carved from single block of black granite, and positioned so that afternoon light from high windows cast the seated king in dramatic illumination, while leaving suppliants in relative shadow. Every aspect of the room's architecture reinforced the message: power resides here, and you exist only in its shadow. Adrian stood before his father with Lyra beside him, both positioned in that carefully calculated darkness, while Marcus sat above them in his pool of light. The king had not spoken yet, had not even acknowledged their presence beyond a dismissive glance when guards had escorted them into the chamber. Instead, he reviewed a document, taking his time, making them wait in a demonstration of control that Adrian had witnessed countless times in his 17 years. Finally, Marcus set aside the document and fixed his gaze on them. His eyes were the same dark brown as Adrian's, but where the son's held questioning intelligence, the father's held absolute certainty. When the king spoke, Thomas translated from his position to Adrian's left, though Adrian could read his father's lips well enough to catch the gist. You left the castle without permission or escort, engaging with an unknown individual in direct violation of security protocols. Marcus began, his voice carrying the resonant quality that marked powerful alphas. Explain yourself. Adrian signed his response, and Thomas voiced it. I went to speak with the traveler because I had experienced something unusual that I wanted to understand. There was no danger, and my actions harmed no one. No danger? Marcus's eyebrow rose. You, deaf and vulnerable, alone in the forest with an unaffiliated Omega whose background and intentions are unknown? You, whose safety determines the stability of this kingdom's succession. You see no danger in this scenario? I am not as vulnerable as you believe. Adrian signed with sharp movements that Thomas translated with visible discomfort. I have trained for years to compensate for my hearing. I can defend myself adequately. Adequately is not sufficient for a crown prince, Marcus said coldly. And your judgment in this matter is clearly compromised if you believe your combat skills make you immune to all forms of threat. This woman could have been an assassin, a spy, or an agent of one of the families who would prefer a different heir. For the first time, Marcus turned his full attention to Lyra. You. State your name and purpose for being in my territory. Lyra met the king's gaze without the deference he clearly expected. I'm called Lyra in most places, though I've had other names. I have no fixed home or pack affiliation. I travel freely as is my right according to the treaties that govern territories. I camped near your castle because the location was convenient. And I engaged with your son because he approached me, not the reverse. I've broken no laws and threatened no one. Marcus's expression hardened at her tone. You have no rights beyond those I permit. As an unaffiliated Omega, you exist in a legal gray area that offers minimal protection. You would do well to remember that before speaking to a territorial alpha with such disrespect. I offer respect when it's earned through just treatment, not demanded through coercion, Lyra replied evenly. If that philosophy is incompatible with your territorial rules, then I'll leave your territory immediately. But I won't be bullied into submission by threats disguised as protocol. The temperature in the throne room seemed to drop several degrees. Several advisors who had been standing along the walls shifted uncomfortably. No one spoke to King Marcus with such directness, least of all an unaffiliated Omega with no pack backing to protect her from retaliation. Adrian felt equal parts admiration for her courage and fear for what his father might do in response to such blatant defiance. But Marcus did not explode into rage as Adrian half expected. Instead, the king leaned forward slightly, studying Lyra with new intensity. You're either remarkably brave or remarkably foolish. Perhaps both. Tell me, Wanderer, what is it you do that makes border guards report unusual reactions wherever you go? I've received reports from 3 different territories about an Omega whose singing affects people strangely. That's you, isn't it? Lyra's expression remained neutral, but Adrian detected a slight tension in her shoulders. I sing. Some people find it affecting. I can't control how individuals respond to music. Don't insult my intelligence, Marcus said sharply. Multiple witnesses have described your voice causing emotional breakdowns, triggering confessions, dissolving carefully maintained composure. That's not normal singing. That's something else, something that disrupts social order and pack hierarchy. Which is why you keep moving, because no alpha wants you staying long enough to destabilize their carefully balanced power structures. If you already know all this, why are you asking? Lyra countered. Because I want to understand what happened between you and my son. What did you do to make him risk his safety and status to seek you out? Adrian signed urgently, drawing his father's attention. She did nothing to me. I felt her singing from my chambers and wanted to understand how it was possible. The initiative was entirely mine. Felt her singing? Marcus repeated, his expression skeptical. You're deaf, Adrian. Profoundly and completely deaf. How could you possibly feel singing? Adrian explained, through Thomas's translation, what he had experienced. The vibrations through the castle walls, the sensation of melody communicated through physical resonance rather than auditory processing, the emotions that had surfaced in response. As he described it, he watched his father's face shift from skepticism to calculation. So your voice can reach even those who cannot hear, Marcus said to Lyra, his tone taking on a speculative quality that Adrian found deeply concerning. That's a remarkable ability. Useful even. An Omega who could communicate with the deaf, who could affect emotional states regardless of auditory capacity. There are applications for such a gift. My voice is not a tool for your use, Lyra said firmly. Whatever you're thinking about applications and usefulness, you can dismiss it immediately. I don't use my singing to manipulate or control people, and I certainly won't do so on behalf of a territorial alpha who sees everything in terms of power and advantage. You speak as though you have a choice in the matter, Marcus observed. But as I've already mentioned, unaffiliated Omegas have very limited rights in my territory. If I determine that your abilities pose a threat to stability, I can restrict your movements indefinitely. If I decide your abilities could serve the kingdom's interests, I can compel your cooperation through perfectly legal means. Adrian signed rapidly, his movements sharp with anger. You cannot imprison her without cause. She has committed no crime. I don't need to prove crime to invoke protective custody, Marcus responded. An Omega without pack protection, possessing abilities that could be exploited by hostile forces? Keeping her within the castle for her own safety would be entirely reasonable under territorial law. She would be housed comfortably, treated well, and in exchange, she could assist with certain matters, such as helping you adapt to your limitations so you might eventually be capable of ruling. The offer was phrased reasonably, but Adrian heard the threat underneath. His father had found something he wanted, Lyra's voice and its unusual properties. If gentle persuasion did not work, Marcus would simply take what he wanted through legal mechanisms that would leave Lyra trapped, but technically well treated. This is wrong, Adrian signed, though he knew the argument was futile before Thomas even finished translating. You cannot imprison someone simply because their abilities might be useful to you. I can and will do whatever serves the kingdom's interests, Marcus said. And right now, the kingdom's interests include preparing you to potentially rule despite your disability. If this woman's voice can help bridge that gap, then her cooperation serves everyone's benefit, including yours. Adrian looked at Lyra, seeing resignation settle over her features. She had been in this position before, he realized, had faced powerful individuals who decided her autonomy was less important than their needs. Usually she escaped by leaving before their control could be formalized, but with guards stationed throughout the castle and her presence now officially noted, escape would be significantly more difficult. How long would this protective custody last? Lyra asked, her voice carefully neutral. As long as necessary, Marcus replied. Certainly long enough to determine whether your abilities can be developed into something useful. Possibly longer if you prove valuable to the kingdom's functioning. Think of it as an extended residency rather than imprisonment. You'll have comfortable quarters, good food, and the opportunity to serve a purpose larger than wandering aimlessly. Serving your purposes, you mean, Lyra said. Under guard and without freedom to leave. That's imprisonment regardless of how you dress it up. Call it what you wish, Marcus said dismissively. The decision is made. Guards will escort you to prepared chambers. My son will visit regularly so you can work together on developing whatever connection your voice creates. And in exchange, you'll be protected, fed, and sheltered through the winter months. Many in your position would consider that fair exchange. Adrian signed desperately to his father. Please reconsider. This is unjust. You're taking her freedom because you see an advantage, not because she's done anything wrong. Justice and advantage often align, Marcus responded. And sometimes the needs of the kingdom must outweigh individual preferences. You'll understand this better when you rule, assuming we can overcome the obvious obstacles to that eventuality. The dismissal was clear. Guards stepped forward to escort Lyra from the throne room, and though she walked with her head high and her expression composed, Adrian could see the defeat in the set of her shoulders. He had brought this upon her by seeking her out, by drawing attention to her abilities, by being too naive to anticipate his father's response. As the guards led Lyra toward the door, she glanced back once. Her gray eyes met Adrian's, and in that look he saw no accusation, only a kind of weary acknowledgement that this was how the world worked for people like them. The powerful took what they wanted, and those without power adapted or suffered. Then she was gone, the heavy doors closing behind her, with a sound Adrian felt as vibration through the floor. He stood alone before his father, feeling more helpless than he had in years. For a few hours, he had experienced genuine connection with someone who understood what it meant to exist outside the normal structures. Now she was trapped because of him, her freedom sacrificed to his father's calculation about what might make Adrian more useful as an heir. "You will regret this," Adrian signed, the movement sharp enough to make Thomas hesitate before translating. "Perhaps," Marcus said, unbothered. "But not as much as I would regret allowing a resource to escape because of misplaced sympathy." "Dismissed, Adrian. And stay within the castle grounds unless you want to find your own freedoms similarly restricted." Adrian left the throne room with his mind already working through possibilities. His father assumed this would simply be absorbed into the usual pattern of royal authority being exercised without meaningful resistance. But Marcus had miscalculated in one important way. He had given Adrian and Lyra reason to work together, to spend time in each other's presence, to develop the very connection he was trying to exploit. And in doing so, he had inadvertently created the conditions for something his careful control had never accounted for. That night, Adrian stood at his window looking out over the castle grounds, feeling the vibrations of life continuing below. Somewhere in the levels beneath him, Lyra was settling into chambers that were comfortable but locked. Adapting to captivity she had done nothing to deserve. He thought about her earlier words, about choosing the harder path because it was honest, rather than the easier path that required self-diminishment. He had spent his life following protocols, accepting limitations, allowing others to define what he could and could not do. But meeting Lyra had shown him an alternative possibility, someone who refused to be diminished, who maintained her integrity even when it cost her safety, who valued authenticity more than comfort. If she could make those choices while facing far greater vulnerability, what excuse did he have for continued passivity? Adrian made a decision in that moment. He would find a way to give Lyra back her freedom, even if it meant opposing his father directly. He would develop whatever connection her voice created, not to make himself more useful to the kingdom, but to understand communication beyond the rigid hierarchies that trapped them both. And he would prove that leadership did not require the kind of dominating authority his father wielded, that there were other ways to exercise power that did not depend on forcing others into submission. It would be difficult. It might be impossible. But the alternative, accepting this injustice and continuing to exist within structures that valued control over humanity, was no longer tolerable. Lyra's presence had changed something fundamental in how he saw his world and his place in it. Now it was his turn to change something in response. Far below, in chambers she had not chosen and could not leave, Lyra sat by her own window and looked out at the same stars. She did not know yet that the prince she had met for only a few hours was already forming plans for her liberation. She knew only that she had been trapped before and had always found a way free, that patience and observation eventually revealed opportunities, and that powerful people consistently underestimated those they believed controlled. She began to hum softly, a melody without words that carried both sorrow and defiance. The sound traveled through stone corridors, brushing past guards who felt suddenly melancholy without understanding why. And high in his tower, Adrian felt the vibrations reach him once more, familiar now, but no less profound. Her song was a message. I am still here, still myself, still free in the ways that matter most. He pressed his hand against the cold stone wall and sent his response in the only way he could. A pattern of deliberate taps, rhythmic and intentional, a prisoner's code spelling out words she probably could not interpret, but might feel nonetheless. Not alone. We'll fix this. Promise. Neither knew if the other received these messages, but both felt less isolated than they had before. And in a castle built on rigid hierarchies and absolute control, that small connection between two people who did not fit the expected patterns was already beginning to create cracks in foundations that had seemed unshakable. The real story was just beginning. What Marcus had intended as a simple matter of exploiting useful resources was about to become something far more complicated, because he had failed to account for the most dangerous variable in any system of control: Two people who recognized each other as fully human and were willing to risk safety for that recognition. Winter was coming to the Northern Territories, and the castle would soon be locked in by snow and ice. But inside those frozen walls, something was beginning to thaw. The routine his father established was simple in its cruelty. Each afternoon, Adrian was escorted to Lyra's chambers where they would spend 2 hours together, while guards waited outside the locked door. The stated purpose was therapeutic. Lyra would sing. Adrian would practice whatever method allowed him to perceive her voice, and gradually they would develop techniques that might help him function more effectively in a world built on auditory communication. King Marcus framed it as beneficial for both of them. Adrian gained potential adaptations for his disability. Lyra gained purpose and comfortable captivity, rather than purposeless imprisonment. But Adrian recognized it for what it truly was. His father testing whether Lyra's unusual abilities could be controlled and directed, using his son as the experimental subject. If successful, Marcus would have validated his decision to detain her and could justify longer-term exploitation. If unsuccessful, he would simply keep her contained as a potential future resource while suffering no real loss beyond the cost of her maintenance. The first session was tense and awkward. Lyra sat on a cushioned bench near the window of her chambers, which were indeed comfortable as promised, well-furnished, warm, with books and art materials provided for her entertainment. But the lock on the door and the guards in the hallway transformed comfort into captivity, and the resentment in her eyes when Adrian entered was unmistakable. "I'm sorry," he signed as soon as the door closed, trusting she would recognize the gesture as apology, even if she did not know formal sign language. He pulled out his journal to write more completely. "This is my fault. I drew attention to you, and now my father is using you because of the connection I created. I'm working on ways to fix this, but it may take time." Lyra read the note and her expression softened slightly, though wariness remained. "You're not responsible for your father's choices. Powerful people take what they want. That's been true everywhere I've traveled. I should have been more careful about camping so close to the castle, but I felt pulled here in ways I didn't understand." "Do you regret it?" Adrian wrote. "Coming here? Meeting me?" She considered the question seriously before answering. "I don't know yet. Ask me again when I'm free, if that day ever comes." They spent that first session mostly in silence, both processing the situation and uncertain how to proceed. Adrian felt the weight of obligation pressing on him. His father expected results, expected him to push Lyra to perform, to demonstrate her abilities so they could be studied and potentially replicated. But doing so felt like betraying the genuine connection they had begun to form, turning her gift into mere utility. Finally, near the end of their allotted time, Lyra spoke. "If I'm going to be trapped here anyway, we might as well understand what's happening between us. When I sing and you feel it, what exactly do you experience?" Adrian wrote carefully, trying to articulate something he barely understood himself. "It's like the vibrations carry more than just physical resonance. They seem to communicate emotion and meaning directly, bypassing the normal pathway of hearing words or melody. When you sang in the forest, I felt grief and longing and hope all woven together, and they felt true and unavoidable. Not just my own suppressed feelings, though those definitely surfaced, but also something from the song itself, as if your voice carries its own emotional content independent of listener interpretation. That makes sense with what I've always felt when singing these particular songs," Lyra said thoughtfully. "Like I'm channeling something that exists beyond my personal experience. My mother used to say our bloodline carried ancient melodies that predated modern pack structures, songs from when communication was more fluid and less hierarchical. She thought maybe our voices accessed something primal that civilization tried to organize away. Could you teach someone else to sing this way?" Adrian wrote, then immediately added, "I'm not asking you to. I'm asking if it's even possible." "I don't think so," Lyra replied. "I've met other Omegas with unusual vocal qualities. There's a tradition of it in certain bloodlines. but none of them could do exactly what I do. It seems to be partly inherent ability, and partly something learned through experience I can't really articulate. Like asking a painter how they know which brushstroke goes where. At some point, it's intuition developed through practice, not technique that can be diagrammed and transferred. Then what my father hopes for, controlling and directing your ability, probably isn't possible anyway. Probably not, she agreed. But that won't stop him from keeping me imprisoned while he tries. And even if I convinced him it couldn't be taught, he'd still want me available for whatever purposes he thinks my voice could serve. Helping you was just the acceptable excuse. The real interest is in having a weapon that can affect people's emotional states regardless of their defenses. The description chilled Adrian because it was undoubtedly accurate. His father thought in terms of leverage and advantage, and someone who could bypass normal social defenses would be valuable for negotiation, interrogation, and control. That Lyra adamantly refused to use her voice that way would be seen as an obstacle to overcome, rather than a boundary to respect. Over the following weeks, their afternoon sessions developed an unspoken purpose different from the official one. Publicly, they were working on techniques to help Adrian function better. Actually, they were building trust and understanding while carefully managing what information reached the king. Lyra would sing, Adrian would respond with genuine reactions, and they would discuss what happened in ways that were true, but incomplete, leaving out the depth of connection forming between them. Because something was definitely forming. The more time they spent together, the more Adrian felt that initial recognition deepened into something more complex. Lyra understood his isolation in ways no one else had, not through pity, but through her own experience of existing outside normal structures. She did not see his deafness as a deficit to overcome, but as a different way of perceiving that brought its own insights. And she challenged his thinking in ways that were uncomfortable but valuable, pushing him to examine assumptions he had accepted without question. For her part, Lyra seemed to find in Adrian a rare listener who could hold the emotional intensity of her singing without trying to escape or control it. Most people reacted to her voice with fear or desire, wanting either to flee from the uncomfortable truths it revealed or to possess the power it represented. Adrian did neither. He simply experienced what her songs offered and then discussed it with thoughtful curiosity, rather than defensive rejection. They talked about everything during those locked room sessions. Adrian described growing up as the disappointing heir, watching his father's affection turn to cold assessment as it became clear his deafness would not resolve. Lyra shared stories from her travels. The Omega who had tried to bond her by force, claiming it was for her own protection. The Alpha who had offered wealth and status in exchange for exclusive access to her voice. The Beta family who had sheltered her for months before their pack leader demanded she leave because her presence was destabilizing established relationships. It's always the same pattern, Lyra said during one session about a month into her captivity. Someone sees what I can do and immediately thinks about how to use it for their own purposes. They never ask what I want or need, never consider that my voice is part of who I am, rather than a tool separate from my identity. Your father is just the most powerful version of something I've encountered repeatedly. Adrian wrote, I promise I will find a way to free you. Even if it takes months, even if I have to oppose my father directly, I won't accept this captivity as permanent. Be careful what you promise, Lyra warned. Opposing a king is dangerous, even for his heir, especially for an heir whose position is already uncertain. Then we'll both be taking risks, Adrian wrote. You risk your voice being exploited. I risk my position being revoked. At least we'll risk together rather than alone. Something shifted in Lyra's expression, vulnerability showing through her usual composure. Why does my freedom matter so much to you? We barely know each other. Yes, there's a connection through my singing reaching you uniquely, but that doesn't obligate you to endanger yourself on my behalf. Adrian paused, considering how to explain something he barely understood himself. Finally, he wrote, Before I met you, I had accepted my isolation as permanent. I believed the world was simply structured in ways that excluded me, and the best I could hope for was to compensate effectively enough to be tolerated. Then your song reached me, and suddenly isolation felt like a choice rather than an inevitability. If communication is possible in ways I never imagined, maybe connection is too. Maybe I don't have to accept that my disability means permanent separation from genuine human relationship. You showed me that possibility. How could I not fight for your freedom when you gave me something so valuable? Lyra was quiet for a long moment after reading his words. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. No one has ever said anything like that to me. Usually, people want something from me. You want something from me. That's different. It's not entirely selfless, Adrian admitted in writing. I want your freedom partly because it's right, but also because I want to keep knowing you. Not under these conditions, with guards and locks and my father's agenda shaping everything, but freely. I want to know who you are when you're not performing under duress. Who I am when I'm free. Lyra considered the question. I'm not sure I remember anymore. It's been so long since I felt truly free, rather than just temporarily unsupervised. Then we'll figure it out together, Adrian wrote, after I get you out of here. But getting her out was proving far more difficult than he had anticipated. The castle was locked down for winter, with guards at every exit, and visitors restricted due to weather and seasonal protocols. His father watched him closely, suspicious of his growing attachment to the captured Omega. And Lyra herself was monitored constantly, her movements within her chambers observed through a small window in the door that allowed guards to verify her presence without entering. Adrian tried multiple approaches. He drafted formal petitions arguing that continued detention without charges violated territorial law, but his father dismissed them without review. He attempted to negotiate directly, offering to guarantee Lyra's future cooperation in exchange for her freedom, but Marcus rejected any terms that gave her autonomy to leave. He even considered bribing guards to look away during a planned escape, but realized that involving others would only endanger them without guaranteeing success. 2 months into Lyra's captivity, Adrian was no closer to freeing her, and the frustration was eating at him. During their afternoon sessions, he could see her spirit dimming despite her efforts to stay positive. The comfortable prison was still a prison, and no amount of books or art supplies could compensate for the loss of open roads and autonomous choice. Then, unexpectedly, an opportunity emerged from the worst possible source. King Marcus announced plans for a winter gathering of allied alphas, a formal event where territorial leaders would discuss shared concerns and reinforce alliances. As part of the gathering, he intended to demonstrate the Crown's advanced approaches to governance, including innovative methods for managing difficult situations. And his primary innovation to showcase was the captured Omega, whose voice could affect even those with auditory disabilities. You will both perform, Marcus told Adrian during a private meeting. You will demonstrate how her singing reaches you despite your deafness, showing our allies that even significant disabilities need not disqualify potential heirs if proper resources are applied. It will strengthen your position, while also demonstrating my kingdom's sophistication in managing unusual talents. The plan was clear and repulsive. Parade Lyra as evidence of the kingdom's control over potentially disruptive abilities, while simultaneously proving that Adrian's disability could be managed through controlled application of her gift. Both would be exhibited like trained animals performing tricks to impress other powerful individuals. Adrian signed his refusal immediately. I will not participate in degrading either of us this way. You will participate, Marcus said coldly, or she will be transferred to far less comfortable accommodations and your access to her will be permanently revoked. The only reason I've allowed these extended sessions is because I believe they're producing useful results. Demonstrate those results at the gathering, and her current situation continues. Refuse, and she suffers the consequences of your stubbornness. It was a perfect trap. Refusing meant Lyra would be punished for his defiance. Participating meant validating his father's exploitation of them both. Either way, Marcus maintained control while they absorbed the costs of their resistance. Adrian looked at his father and felt something fundamental shift inside him. For 17 years, he had tried to be what this man wanted, trying to compensate for his disability enough to earn approval that never came. But approval earned through submission was worthless, and acceptance that required degrading others was not worth having. "Do your worst," Adrian signed. "I will not perform on command, and neither will she. Transfer her to dungeons if you must. Revoke my access to her completely. Demonstrate to your allied alphas that your own son refuses to cooperate with your plans. Show them that for all your power, you cannot control the two people whose cooperation would be most valuable. Let them see weakness in your household that no amount of military strength can compensate for." Marcus's face darkened with rage, but beneath the anger, Adrian detected something else: uncertainty. His father had not anticipated outright defiance, had assumed that threats to Lyra's well-being would ensure compliance. But by calling his bluff and accepting the worst consequences, Adrian had revealed the limits of threat-based control. "You have no idea what you're risking," Marcus said, his voice low and dangerous. "Your position as heir, your mother's peace of mind, your own freedom of movement within the castle. All of it can be restricted if you persist in this foolishness." "Then restrict it," Adrian signed. "But you'll do so knowing that every restriction makes clear your fear of what we represent. The possibility that power built on domination and hierarchy is fragile when people refuse to be dominated. Father and